"Don't touch that violin again." Rebecca Sloane's voice cut across Union Central Station as the oldest string snapped loose and whipped past 11-year-old Sophie Bennett's fingers. Dan Mercer dropped to one knee, opened his battered metal toolbox, and steadied the scarred instrument while Sophie clutched its frayed case against her chest. "It was my mom's," she whispered. Victor Hale stepped forward, one polished hand reaching for the violin. "That instrument needs to be secured." Dan struck his A440 tuning fork. Sophie drew the bow across one trembling note, and billionaire Eleanor Whitmore, already walking toward her train, dropped her first-class ticket and turned around. 3 hours earlier, the station had smelled of machine oil, burnt coffee, and rain carried in on hundreds of coats. Dan stood inside an open ticket scanner with a screwdriver between his fingers, listening to a faint metallic scrape that did not belong beneath the normal rhythm of rolling luggage and departure announcements. His 10-year-old daughter, Emily, sat safely on a nearby bench doing math homework, her purple backpack tucked between her boots. Near the sponsored performance area, Sophie opened a violin case whose velvet lining had worn pale along the edges. A small piece of blue cloth showed beneath one torn corner, but she pushed it back before setting the instrument beneath her chin. Dan noticed the A string sat too high in the groove. Someone had wound it unevenly around the peg. Before he could say anything, Rebecca crossed the marble floor in sharp black heels, smiling the careful smile printed on station brochures. "Sweetheart, this area is reserved for approved performers." Sophie showed her a temporary paper tag. Rebecca glanced at it, peeled it from the case, and folded it once. "Your instructor's verification is incomplete." "Ms. Bell knows me," Sophie said. "She taught me before my mom got sick." Margaret Bell stood beside the Hale Foundation banner, adjusting sheet music for 3 children in matching navy jackets. She looked at Sophie, then lowered her eyes. Victor arrived without hurrying. His silver tie caught the fluorescent light as he examined the violins darkened. "We can give her a new student instrument," he said warmly. "Something safe. Something appropriate." Sophie's arms tightened around the old case. "I don't want a new one." Rebecca reached for the handle. Sophie pulled back, and the violin shifted inside with a dry wooden creak. Dan was moving before he had decided to move. He crossed the floor, placed one hand beneath the case, and stopped Rebecca from twisting it farther. "The string tension is wrong," he said. "Another pull could crack the top plate." Rebecca's smile disappeared at the edges. "Mr. Mercer, return to your assigned equipment. Let me lower the tension first. You are not authorized to repair private property during paid hours." Emily had come close enough to catch his sleeve, but she stayed behind his shoulder. "Dad," she said quietly, "her hand is shaking." Dan looked at Sophie's white knuckles, then at the maintenance badge clipped to his jacket. Losing a shift meant groceries moved to the credit card again. Losing station access could mean worse. He set his toolbox on the marble anyway. "One note," he told Sophie. "That's all we need." Victor's gaze dropped to the chin rest. "No one removes that piece," he said. Dan's fingers paused on the latch. No one had mentioned removing anything. Then Sophie played, Eleanor turned, and Dan saw Victor's hand tighten. Not at the sound, but at the thin blue thread caught beneath a newer screw on the violin's chin rest. Dan kept his eyes on the blue thread caught beneath the newer screw. Victor's hand had tightened before Eleanor spoke, before anyone asked about the violin, before Sophie had even lowered her bow. "Step away from the instrument." Rebecca's voice stayed quiet. "Your access is suspended." "She still owns it," Dan said. "That is not yours to decide." The last vibration of Sophie's note disappeared beneath the station's high ceiling. Around them, suitcase wheels resumed their hard rhythm over marble, but the people nearest the performance area remained still, watching the maintenance worker in a faded blue jacket face, a man whose name filled the silver banner behind him. Rebecca tapped her tablet, and Dan's badge gave a soft electronic chirp as it was disabled. Mr. Mercer used station tools on private property after a direct instruction to stop, she announced to the security supervisor. Document possible damage to the violin. Dan looked down at the toolbox inherited from his father. The tuning fork, graphite pencil, and narrow peg tool were his own, each fitted into worn red felt. Those aren't station tools. We can sort that out later. Please write down what you saw. Rebecca's finger paused above the screen. Fluorescent light shone across the tight skin at her knuckles, and the perfume she wore, clean, floral, expensive, cut strangely through the smell of brake dust and old coffee. Then she entered something without letting him see it. Margaret Bell stepped closer, carrying a black folder embossed with the Hale Foundation seal. Sophie has struggled with consistency, she said gently. This kind of public attention may not be healthy for her. I didn't do anything, Sophie said. You missed 6 weeks of instruction. My mom was sick. Margaret's mouth closed, but only for a second. She turned toward Eleanor instead of the child. There were attendance concerns. Sophie's bow hand lowered until the horsehair nearly touched the floor. Emily moved beside her and quietly lifted the bow by its wooden stick before it could scrape the marble. Dan noticed, but he did not praise her aloud. He simply placed the bow back inside Sophie's case and folded the frayed velvet over it with both hands. Her guardian should be called, he said. The foundation can handle this compassionately, Victor replied. We can provide Sophie with a proper student violin today. And this one? Sophie asked. We would preserve it. Victor smiled as though offering shelter from a storm. Old instruments often carry more emotional value than practical value. Sophie pressed the case against her coat. The small square of blue cloth had slipped out again, 2 pale stitched letters showing before she pushed it beneath the lining with her thumb. Victor's eyes followed the movement. That fabric should stay where it is, he said. Eleanor turned toward him. Why? Loose material can affect storage conditions. Inside a closed case. I'm speaking generally. The answer was smooth, but too quick. Eleanor did not challenge him again. She asked Rebecca for the written policy governing temporary performers, then read the first page in silence while her assistant held the fallen first-class ticket between 2 fingers. The instructor verification is missing, Rebecca said, and the safety clause permits removal. Which clause? Eleanor asked. Rebecca scrolled. The station announcement above them called the Boston train for final boarding. No one in Eleanor's group moved. We'll provide the full policy to your office, Rebecca said. Dan crouched near the case and photographed the fresh scrape beside its brass lock. He placed his disabled badge next to it so the image would preserve scale and time. Rebecca noticed. You are no longer assigned to this matter. I'm not assigning myself. Then stop documenting station property. The case belongs to Sophie. Victor took one measured step forward. Mr. Mercer, you are making a frightened child believe she is in danger. Dan looked at Sophie, not at him. Are you afraid of me? Sophie shook her head. I'm afraid they'll take my mom's violin. Dan closed the case but left Sophie's hand on the handle. Then nobody moves it until your guardian gets here. The security supervisor shifted uncomfortably. 2 members of the sponsored youth ensemble looked away. Rebecca's tablet chimed with the completed suspension report, and Dan saw his name beneath a line assigning him responsibility for pre-existing string instability and possible structural interference. He could have argued. Instead, he took a paper receipt from the printer slot, folded it once, and placed it in his toolbox. Eleanor watched him do it. She still did not tell Rebecca to restore his badge, but her gaze remained on the way he stood between Sophie and the cameras without once touching the violin again. Victor adjusted his silver cuff and spoke softly to Rebecca. Move the Rourke instrument before the press arrives. Dan's head lifted. The case had never been opened far enough for anyone to see the maker's label. Dan did not look at Victor when he said the maker's name. He looked at the violin case, then at the reflection of Victor's silver tie in the dark window beside them. Sophie's guardian is 20 minutes away, the security supervisor said. Until then, nobody removes the instrument. That is unnecessarily dramatic, Victor replied. The child needs calm. She needs her property left alone, Dan said. The station lights hummed overhead. A cart of wet umbrellas rattled past, carrying the smell of rainwater and metal, while the disabled badge on Dan's chest felt suddenly heavier than it should have. Rebecca informed him that he was no longer permitted in employee-only areas, then turned away to answer a call. Dan waited until she was out of earshot before guiding Sophie and Emily toward a narrow staff alcove beside lost luggage, a space with 2 plastic chairs, a humming vending machine, and a door that no longer latched unless it was lifted by the handle. "We can stay where people can see us," he told Sophie. "Your case stays in your hands." Sophie nodded and sat with the violin across her knees. Emily took the chair beside her, opened her lunch bag, and held out half a peanut butter sandwich. "I already ate the crust," she said. Sophie accepted it with both hands. Dan turned his toolbox so the girls could see everything inside before he touched the violin again. The old red felt had worn through beneath the peg shaper. His father's initials were scratched into the lid, nearly erased by years of use. He checked his phone. The banking app showed $43 until Friday, and the grocery reminder Emily had typed that morning still waited beneath it. Milk, eggs, dish soap. He closed the screen before either girl could see. "How much?" Sophie asked. "For the string." "Nothing. I have $7. Keep it." She placed 3 crumpled bills and 4 coins on the table anyway. Dan slid them back beneath her fingers. "You may need bus fare." He loosened the remaining tension 1 peg at a time, then used the graphite from Emily's mechanical pencil to darken the narrow groove in the nut. The movement was ordinary, almost invisible. A father borrowing a child's pencil, a worn string resting across his thumbnail, a girl chewing half a sandwich while trying not to cry. No one clapped. No one offered him his job back. Through the glass wall, Eleanor stood with her assistant and watched without coming closer. Victor saw her watching and gave a small, pitying smile. "He means well," he said. "Men like that often confuse interference with protection." Eleanor did not answer. Dan fitted his only spare a string, then stopped when the chin rest shifted beneath his hand. 1 screw was newer than the other, bright where the surrounding metal had dulled brown. A single blue fiber was pinched beneath its head. "Did anyone repair this recently?" he asked. Sophie shook her head. "Mom never let anyone touch it except her." Dan reached for a clean cloth, but instead of polishing the wood, he lifted the chin rest only enough to remove pressure from the mismatched screw. Underneath, shallow marks emerged through the grime. He angled the violin toward the vending machine light and read them once without speaking. "CW, come home on the high note." Emily leaned forward. "Is that a message?" "Maybe. For Sophie." Dan lowered the instrument. "We don't guess with things that matter." He used his phone to photograph the inscription, the screw, and the trapped blue thread. Then he placed the suspension receipt beside the violin and took another picture so the printed time was visible. Sophie watched him. "Are you going to tell the rich lady?" "I'm going to tell your guardian first." "What if they take it?" Dan folded his jacket and laid it across the back of her chair so the cold air from the vent would not hit her shoulders. "Then they will have to explain in writing why they think they can." Victor appeared in the doorway before Eleanor reached it. "A scratched inscription proves nothing," he said. The room went still. Dan's phone remained raised, its screen showing only the underside of the violin turned away from the hall. He had never said there was an inscription. Victor's words settled into the little room more sharply than a raised voice could have. Eleanor stopped outside the doorway, one hand resting against the silver swallow brooch on her coat. "What inscription?" she asked. Victor's expression did not change. "Mr. Mercer appears determined to turn ordinary wear into a mystery." "I asked what inscription." "Something scratched beneath the chin rest, apparently." Dan lowered his phone and placed it face up on the vending machine table. The photograph showed the pale marks clearly, but not enough of the room for anyone to claim he had staged them. "How did you know where it was?" he asked. "No accusation." No speech, just 6 quiet words. The compressor inside the vending machine clicked off, and for a moment the only sound was the dry flutter of a departure board changing tracks. Victor glanced toward Sophie. Old instruments are commonly marked in that location. Then why did you call it scratched? Dan asked. You haven't seen it. Rebecca stepped into the doorway before Victor had to answer. She carried her tablet against her chest like a shield. Mr. Mercer has already been suspended for unauthorized interference. We should not treat anything discovered after that interference as reliable. Her argument was reasonable enough to slow the room. Dan had touched the violin. He had changed a string. He had lifted the chin rest. To Eleanor, who had spent decades watching people turn proximity to wealth into opportunity, that mattered. Her eyes moved from Dan's work jacket to the disabled badge clipped beneath his name, then to Sophie's violin resting across the girl's knees. Did anyone witness every step? Eleanor asked. My daughter and Sophie were here, Dan said. Children are not independent witnesses, Rebecca replied. Emily looked down at her sneakers. Dan rested one hand lightly on her shoulder before she could defend him. She doesn't need to be. He opened the photo information screen and turned the phone toward Eleanor. The image carried a timestamp from before Victor entered the alcove. Beside the violin lay Dan's suspension receipt, its printed time visible down to the minute. Eleanor studied it without touching the device. That proves when the photograph was taken, she said. Not who made the marks. Correct. Dan's answer made her look at him again. He was not asking her to believe more than the evidence could hold. Then we test what can be tested, she said. Sophie's fingers tightened around the edge of the case. Do I have to give it to him? She nodded toward Victor. No, Eleanor said, then corrected herself. Not without your guardian present. Victor smiled faintly. A sensible precaution. In the meantime, perhaps we can determine whether the melody itself means anything. He made the suggestion as if it were his own act of patience. Eleanor's assistant brought over a small black recording box from her leather case, the kind used to digitize old cassette tapes. Its plastic edges were worn white, and a strip of masking tape across the back carried a date written in blue ink. Eleanor set it on the table but did not press play. I have a family recording, she said. A melody my sister used to play. It may be similar. Similar is not proof. Done noted. Then don't play it for Sophie first. Victor's gaze sharpened. Why not? Because then she could copy it. The room slowed again. Eleanor looked at Sophie. Can you play only the last 4 measures you remember? Sophie swallowed. I think so. No one will help you. Okay. A foundation violinist was called from the performance area and asked to play the printed version of the phrase. It ended cleanly on the expected high note. Then Sophie lifted her mother's violin. Her bow trembled once before settling. She played the same passage, but held the high note a fraction too long and let it fall by a half step, soft enough that the ending seemed less finished than returned. Eleanor closed her eyes. Only then did she press the button on the recording box. Static breathed through its tiny speaker. A young woman laughed somewhere behind the hiss, then played 4 measures. The final note lingered and dropped in exactly the same way. Sophie stared at the box. My mom sang words there. What words? Eleanor asked. Sophie searched her memory, her lips moving before sound came. When the high note finds you. She shook her head. I don't remember the rest. Victor stepped closer. Old family tunes often travel. Claire may have taught it publicly at the main house. Eleanor's thumb froze over the stop button. No one had mentioned Maine. Dan looked from the date on the masking tape to the email notification that had just appeared on Eleanor's assistant's phone. A 3-week-old request from a Hale-linked company asking for the value of the Missing Whitmore Commission. The words Missing Whitmore Commission remained on Eleanor's assistant's phone, while the old recording box hissed on the table. Open the original email, Eleanor said. Not the forwarded copy. This may be a misunderstanding, Victor replied. Then the original should clear it up. Dan said nothing. He watched Victor's polished thumbnail press against the edge of his cuff, then release. The movement was small, but it repeated when Eleanor's assistant found that the request had come from a company sharing an accounting address with the Hale Foundation. Victor suggested they continue the discussion privately. Eleanor instead called an independent conservator whose name did not appear on any Whitmore or Hale payroll. 40 minutes later, a gray-haired woman named Dr. Lena Ortiz entered the station carrying a hard black case and a portable inspection lamp. By then, Sophie's guardian had arrived and stood beside her with one hand resting gently against the back of her coat. Rebecca had moved them into a glass-walled conference room overlooking the central clock. The air smelled of copier toner and lemon cleaner. Sophie sat at the far end of the table with Emily beside her, the violin case between their chairs. Dan remained near the door because his badge was still suspended. "Mr. Mercer does not need to participate," Rebecca said. "He has already altered the instrument." Dr. Ortiz looked at Dan's time-stamped photographs. "He documented the condition before touching the chin rest." "He is a maintenance technician," Victor said pleasantly, "not a conservator."
Dan nodded.
"That's true." His agreement took the force out of the insult. He did not claim expertise he did not have. He only pointed toward the mismatched screw beneath the chin rest. "Before you turn that, check the thread direction." Dr. Ortiz placed the violin beneath the inspection lamp. The scarred varnish glowed amber, while the newer screw flashed cold silver. Beside the older brown one, she fitted a tool over it and began to apply pressure. Dan heard the faintest wooden tick. "Stop!" Every head turned toward him. "The screw is pulling sideways." Victor gave a patient sigh. "Doctor, surely you can determine that yourself." Dr. Ortiz removed the tool and leaned closer. A magnifying lens descended over one eye. "He's right. The replacement screw has the wrong pitch." The wheels of a chair stopped scraping across the floor. The ventilation system became suddenly loud above them. Eleanor lowered the printed email onto the table. Dr. Ortiz explained that removing the screw normally could tear a thin section of century-old maple beneath the fitting. Dan took a scrap of soft packing wood from the conservator's case, asked permission, then demonstrated how mismatched threads climbed instead of releasing. He never touched the violin. "You've done this before?" Eleanor asked. "On old fixtures and instrument fittings," Dan said. "The material changes. Bad pressure doesn't." Dr. Ortiz used a stabilizing clamp and extracted the screw without damaging the wood. Beneath the chin rest lay the engraved words Dan had photographed, a disturbed line of dust, and a faint crescent of fresh adhesive. Inside the violin, visible through the F-hole under the inspection light, was a dark maker's label, Elias Rourke, Boston. A handwritten serial number curved beneath the name. Victor folded his hands. "Rourke labels have been copied for decades. We should avoid giving the child false hope." "Agreed," Dan said. Sophie looked at him, surprised. "A label is not proof by itself." Dr. Ortiz photographed the serial number and searched a restricted conservator's registry. The violin matched a privately commissioned pair made for the Whitmore family. The room did not erupt. It simply went quiet. Sophie's shoulders lowered by less than an inch, as if she had finally been allowed to breathe without someone correcting her. Eleanor asked her assistant to preserve the original email, prevent deletion of station footage, and request all service records connected to the violin's serial number. Victor leaned toward her. "There is no reason to turn an unfortunate administrative problem into a public accusation." Eleanor did not look at him. "Then the records will protect you." Dr. Ortiz found a recent repair entry dated 3 weeks earlier. It listed replacement of one chin rest screw and inspection of the internal label. The invoice had been paid by a shell company tied to the Hale Foundation. Victor's face remained composed, but his fingertips flattened against the table. "I have never seen that instrument before today," he said. Dan looked at the payment code printed beneath the invoice, then at the station access number beside it. "Who used this building to bring it to the shop?" he asked. Eleanor's assistant opened the station service log. At 8:17 on the night Sophie's violin disappeared from temporary storage, a senior management credential had unlocked the property room and kept it open for 47 minutes. The senior management credential belonged to Rebecca Sloan. She stared at the service log as if the numbers might rearrange themselves if no one spoke. "That does not prove I entered the room," she said. Credentials are shared during maintenance events. Dan looked at the access column, then at the camera status printed beside it. Was there a maintenance event? Rebecca's lips parted. The conference room printer finished one page, clicked twice, and went silent. Outside the glass, the giant station clock advanced another minute while hundreds of travelers moved beneath it, unaware that a 47-minute entry had just changed the shape of the story. Eleanor's assistant pulled the corresponding security footage. The hallway camera showed normal traffic until 8:23, then a gray screen marked manual test mode. It returned 11 minutes later. Convenient, Victor said softly. Or corrupted. The system wasn't corrupted, Dan replied. The log would show a restart. Rebecca turned toward him. You no longer work on this system. I maintained that camera bank for 6 years. And you were suspended today. The words were professional, almost gentle, but their purpose was clear. Make his knowledge look like resentment. Dan could have answered with the blame written on his suspension form. Instead, he glanced toward Sophie. She sat beside her guardian with the violin case against her shins, listening to adults discuss the night her mother's instrument had disappeared as if the child were furniture. Can she wait outside with Emily? He asked. She has heard enough. Sophie's guardian nodded. Emily took Sophie's hand, and the two girls left for the adjoining office, where the glass had been frosted halfway up for privacy. Dan waited until the door closed before continuing. The camera across from property storage may not be the only angle. Rebecca shook her head. There isn't another station camera. Not a station camera. Dan pointed through the conference room glass toward the bookstore opposite the corridor. Its dark display window reflected the hallway like a narrow mirror. The store's security camera had been aimed at the cash register, but the polished glass behind it captured a thin, reversed image of the property room door. Eleanor ordered the bookstore footage preserved through station council. Victor asked for a private recess. Eleanor declined. When the video appeared, its angle was poor and the figures were small, but the timestamps matched. Rebecca entered the hallway. 3 minutes later, she handed Sophie's violin case to Victor. He gave her a cream-colored envelope. The image froze with the envelope between them. Rebecca's face lost color. It was not money. No one had accused her of taking money. Eleanor's assistant opened the personnel records Rebecca had authorized that morning. Inside was a pending contract amendment granting her oversight of all sponsored events, a salary increase, and a regional management title. Attached to it was a Hale Foundation clause allowing unclaimed or disputed instruments to be transferred into temporary foundation custody for 72 hours. Dan read the clause once. How many times has this been used? Rebecca did not answer. A search of station property records found 7 instruments transferred under the same language in 18 months. 3 owners had filed complaints. 2 had been blamed for incomplete documentation. 1 file had been closed after its camera footage was reported. Missing. Victor removed a handkerchief and pressed it briefly to his temple. This is becoming a reckless interpretation of routine charitable work. Then why was Sophie's violin described as unclaimed before she was denied permission to play? Eleanor asked. Her assistant placed a printed email beside the repair invoice. It had been sent that morning, 40 minutes before Rebecca removed Sophie's temporary tag. The subject line read, Hale Intake Authorization. Sophie's guardian returned carrying a worn document envelope. Inside were school records explaining Sophie's 6-week absence, a hospital visitor tag bearing Claire Bennett's name, and a faded photograph of Claire holding the same violin. Around Claire's wrist was a strip of blue cloth embroidered with 2 letters, E and C. Pinned to her coat was 1/2 of a silver swallow. Eleanor touched the matching brooch at her collar. For several seconds, she could not speak. Then she looked at the hospital tag and said, Claire called me from that hospital. Her voice had lost its boardroom steadiness. I saw her name. I let it ring. Dan did not soften the evidence for her, but he did not use the confession as a weapon. He slid the documents back toward Sophie's guardian. Make copies. Keep the originals with her. Eleanor nodded, not because he was poor, not because she pitied him, but because every step he had taken protected Sophie before it protected his own name. Victor reached for the contract. Eleanor placed her hand over it first. At that moment, Rebecca's tablet received a media alert. Victor Hale had scheduled a press conference beneath Union Central's main clock to address false accusations surrounding a charitable instrument donation. The truth was no longer waiting behind a closed door. Victor had already chosen the room where he intended to bury it. The press riser stood beneath Union Central Station's great brass clock, exactly where Sophie had been told her mother's violin did not belong. White lights faced the marble floor. Microphones carried the names of local networks, and travelers slowed behind the velvet rope as Victor Hale stepped to the podium in a charcoal suit, composed enough to make innocence look like a professional skill. Dan arrived without his work badge. His blue maintenance jacket was still creased from the day, and the metal toolbox in his hand looked small beside the Hale Foundation banners. Sophie stood behind her guardian and a child advocate, the violin case held against her knees. Emily stayed at Dan's side, 2 fingers curled into his sleeve. Eleanor Whitmore took a place near the edge of the platform, close enough to intervene, but she said nothing. Victor began with regret. A child's grief has been turned into a public spectacle. Camera shutters clicked. A suspended employee interfered with a fragile instrument, encouraged speculation, and placed unnecessary pressure on a vulnerable young performer. Rebecca stood behind him holding a prepared statement. Margaret Bell sat near the front, hands folded over her black folder. For several seconds, Victor's explanation worked. It was orderly, compassionate, familiar. Dan could hear whispers moving through the crowd. Maintenance worker, damaged violin, billionaire family. Victor raised one hand. The foundation offered Sophie a safe replacement instrument. Our only concern was preservation. Sophie's guardian lowered her head toward the child. You do not have to speak. Sophie nodded and stayed silent. Dan set his toolbox beneath the podium but did not open it. An investigator placed the old violin inside a clear protective stand. The scarred wood caught the same station light that had made it look worthless that morning. Mr. Mercer, Victor said, do you deny replacing the string? No. Do you deny lifting the chin rest? No. A murmur passed through the reporters. Victor allowed a careful pause. Then we agree the instrument was altered while in his possession. The first retention spike landed quietly. The facts sounded like guilt because Victor had arranged them without context. Eleanor watched Dan, waiting to see whether pressure would turn discipline into anger. Dan looked toward Sophie before answering. I lowered dangerous tension. I documented it first. I stopped when I found evidence. The investigator displayed the time-stamped photograph on the station screen. The damaged string appeared beside Dan's suspension receipt, the printed minute visible. A second image showed the mismatched screw and blue thread before Victor entered the staff alcove. That proves only that he took pictures, Victor said. It does not prove who damaged the instrument. Correct, Dan replied. His refusal to exaggerate made the room quieter than denial would have. The investigator then presented the repair invoice. 3 weeks earlier, the chin rest screw had been replaced, the internal label inspected, and the bill paid by a Hale-linked shell company. Victor did not flinch. Foundations use outside entities for acquisitions and conservation. I do not approve every invoice. It was plausible. Reporters began typing again. Rebecca's shoulders loosened slightly. Victor had found another way to make the evidence look administrative. Eleanor finally stepped closer to the microphone. Did you know the violin was an Elias Rourke before today? No. Did you know about the engraving? I knew old commissions were sometimes marked. Did you know where? Beneath the chin rest is common. Dan opened his toolbox and removed the folded suspension paper. On its back, in pencil, was the sentence he had written immediately after Victor's slip. A scratched inscription proves nothing. The investigator projected Dan's photograph metadata and the hallway timestamp. Victor had spoken those words before anyone had described the marks as scratched. I may have overheard someone, he said. Dan's voice remained low. From outside a closed room, before we said it aloud? A microphone stand stopped squeaking as a technician froze with one hand on it. The station clock clicked overhead. The second retention spike came when the investigator displayed the reflected bookstore footage. Rebecca handing the violin case to Victor during the 11 missing camera minutes. Victor's expression tightened only at the corners. That image is distorted. Ms. Sloan asked me to inspect a potentially abandoned instrument under our agreement. Eleanor looked toward Rebecca. Before or after Sophie was denied permission to perform? Rebecca glanced at her prepared statement. Before, she whispered. Victor turned slightly. Be precise. The warning was soft, but every microphone caught it. The investigator placed the funding contract beside the suspension sheet, the service log, the invoice, and the email labeling the violin unclaimed 40 minutes before Sophie's temporary tag was removed. Victor spread his hands. Poor wording is not theft. Administrative coordination is not conspiracy. And Mr. Mercer's resentment over discipline should not become evidence. Dan did not move toward him. This is not about getting even. He looked at the violin beneath the clear cover. It is about making sure a child's property cannot disappear because adults believe no one important will ask for it. Eleanor's eyes shifted to Sophie, who reached into the case pocket and handed her guardian the small blue cloth embroidered E and C. She said only, "That was already there." Victor looked toward the station cameras, then back to the investigator. The outage began at 8:42. Anything recorded after that could have been mishandled. The investigator's hand stopped over the service log. No public document had stated the minute the camera was switched. Rebecca closed her eyes. Then, instead of reading Victor's prepared statement, she reached into her folder and removed a black USB drive. "There is one recording he believed I deleted," she said, placing it beside the violin while every screen in the station went dark and waited for the file to open. The first sound from the USB was not Victor Hale's voice. It was Rebecca's office door closing, followed by the faint click of a recorder being set on a desk. Then Victor spoke through the station speakers, calm and unmistakable. "Mark the violin as unclaimed before the child reaches the stage." A reporter lowered her phone. Somewhere beyond the velvet rope, a suitcase will squeaked once and stopped. Victor's face did not change, but his right hand closed around the podium until the knuckles showed white beneath the lights. The recording continued. Rebecca's voice was quieter. "She has a temporary permit. Remove it. And if her guardian objects?" Victor exhaled. "The child has no one powerful enough to sue. By the time anyone asks questions, the instrument will be in Foundation custody." The station went silent. Not politely quiet. Silent enough for Dan to hear Emily's fingernail tap once against the metal button on his sleeve. Silent enough for the cooling fan inside the projection screen to sound like wind in an empty tunnel. Victor leaned toward the microphone. "A private conversation can be edited." The investigator raised one hand. The file's metadata appeared above him. Date, device identification, original length, server backup, and checksum. Rebecca had forwarded the recording to her station account the same night, before the press conference, creating an independent timestamp. Eleanor's assistant displayed the matching email chain. Victor's authorization to label the violin unclaimed had been sent 40 minutes before Rebecca removed Sophie's performance tag. The service log placed Rebecca's credential at the property room. The reflected bookstore camera placed the violin in Victor's hands. The repair invoice showed his linked company had already paid to expose the maker's label 3 weeks earlier. The evidence did not shout. It locked together. Victor's attorney whispered in his ear. Victor looked toward the exit, then toward the cameras, but the professional warmth had left his face. His pen slipped from the podium and struck the marble with a small, hard click. Eleanor stepped forward. She did not look at Victor first. She looked at Sophie. The child stood behind her guardian with both hands wrapped around the blue cloth embroidered E and C. Dr. Ortiz approached the clear display stand and read the Elias Rourke serial number aloud. Eleanor's assistant then placed 3 certified documents beneath the camera: Claire Bennett's hospital record, Sophie's birth certificate, and the original Whitmore commission ledger. The dates aligned. Claire Whitmore had used the surname Bennett after leaving her family. Sophie Bennett was her daughter. The old violin was one of 2 instruments commissioned for Eleanor and Claire as girls. A photograph appeared on the screen. 2 sisters on a porch, each holding a violin, each wearing half of a silver swallow. The cloth around Claire's wrist was the same blue fabric Sophie now held. Eleanor touched the brooch at her collar, but she did not reach for Sophie. "Claire was my sister," she said. Her voice broke on the final word, yet she did not hide behind grief. "I ignored her last call. I allowed pride to become distance, and distance to become abandonment. Sophie does not owe me forgiveness because we share blood." Victor tried once more. "This family matter does not establish criminal intent." The investigator turned back to the recording. Victor's own voice filled the station again. "Once the serial is confirmed, move it through the shell company. No public inventory." The words ended. No one spoke after them. Eleanor faced the microphones. She terminated every Whitmore contract with the Hale Foundation, suspended the station partnership, and authorized an outside audit of all 7 instruments transferred under the same policy. Station counsel announced that Victor's access credentials were frozen, his records preserved, and the case referred for civil and criminal review. Rebecca was removed from management pending investigation, though her cooperation would be formally documented. Then Eleanor ordered Dan's suspension rescinded, his lost wages restored, and the accusation against him removed from his employment record. Dan did not smile at Victor. He did not look toward the reporters. He opened the protective stand only after Dr. Ortiz gave permission, lifted the violin with both hands, and returned it to Sophie. When camera operators moved closer, he stepped between their lights and the child. "She is not evidence for your show," he said. Sophie looked up at him, then toward Eleanor. "Can I play it?" Dan checked the repaired string and gave one small nod. Sophie raised the bow. The same high note that had made Eleanor turn around now traveled beneath the great brass clock, held for one breath longer than expected before falling by half a step. Eleanor covered her mouth. Rebecca lowered her eyes. Victor stood without an explanation left. When the note faded, Sophie did not run into Eleanor's arms. She asked her guardian, "Could I meet her again sometime, but not alone?" Eleanor nodded through tears. "Only when you choose." Dan watched Sophie close the violin case herself, and for the first time that day, powerful people were waiting for a child's decision instead of making it for her. Then Eleanor turned to him and asked what he wanted in return, and Dan looked down at his disabled badge, his daughter's hand in his sleeve, and the toolbox that had cost him almost everything to open. The crowd beneath Union Central's great brass clock did not applaud when the announcements ended. Reporters lowered their microphones. Travelers stepped around the velvet ropes more quietly than before, and the station's ordinary sounds returned one by one. Suitcase wheels, distant brakes, the soft chime of a departing train. Victor Hale left through a side corridor with counsel beside him and his access credentials already disabled. Rebecca remained long enough to sign the preservation order for the station records, then surrendered her management badge without argument. Dan watched neither of them go. He was kneeling beside Emily, fastening the loose strap on her purple backpack while Sophie's guardian spoke with the child advocate about getting the girl home without cameras following them. Eleanor waited near the podium. "You did not answer me," she said when the last television light switched off. "What do you want?" Dan stood and placed his toolbox on the marble between them. Its paint was chipped, the handle darkened by years of sweat and machine oil. That morning, people had looked at it and seen a maintenance worker who did not know his place. Now Eleanor looked at it as the reason a child's property had survived long enough for the truth to catch up. "Fix my employment record," Dan said. "Restore the wages I lost. Then review every instrument taken under that policy." Eleanor nodded. "And for yourself?" "That is for myself." 6 months later, the station-sponsored performance wall no longer carried Victor's name. In its place hung a plain public notice listing the rights of young performers, the number for an independent advocate, and a rule stating that no donor, manager, or foundation could remove personal property without documented consent. Camera systems required 2 authorized approvals before entering test mode. 7 old instrument cases had been reopened, for owners located, and 2 families compensated after the audit found missing records. Victor faced fraud, property, and records investigations through the courts, not through a public spectacle. Rebecca lost her management position. Her cooperation was included in the official report, and after ethics training she was allowed to apply for a limited administrative role with no control over children, property intake, or surveillance. Dan had been offered a ceremonial executive title by Eleanor's board. He declined it. Instead, he applied through an independent hiring panel to lead a small community instrument repair workshop in an unused room near Track 12. He earned the position after presenting a practical plan for donated tools, supervised apprenticeships, and free repairs for children whose families could not afford them. His first paycheck included the wages the station had withheld. The public apology remained posted beside the new policy, not hidden in an email. Sophie still lived with the guardian who had cared for her before anyone knew the Whitmore name. She met Eleanor once a week in a community music room with a family counselor nearby. Eleanor brought no jewelry, no contracts, and no promises of a different life. She brought Claire's unopened letters in a plain archival box and allowed Sophie to decide when each one would be read. Sometimes Sophie asked questions. Sometimes she practiced scales while Eleanor sat 3 chairs away and listened. The distance between them became smaller only when Sophie chose it. On the morning the repair workshop opened, Emily labeled drawers while staying safely away from blades and solvents. Sophie sat at Dan's bench with her old violin resting on a folded blue cloth. The letters E and C were visible beside the 2 halves of the silver swallow brooch. Dan placed a new A string in Sophie's palm. "I thought you fixed these," she said. "Ido." "Then why am I doing it?" "Because it belongs to you." He guided her fingers once, then removed his hands. Sophie wound the string. Slowly, checked the groove with the graphite from Emily's pencil, and struck Dan's A440 tuning fork against the rubber pad. The clear note filled the workshop. Eleanor sat in the 3rd row, not the 1st. When Sophie finished, she carried the violin to her, opened one of Claire's letters, and asked if they could read it together. Eleanor moved her chair closer but waited for Sophie to begin. Dan turned back to the bench. His old toolbox stood open beneath the warm work light, no longer evidence of how little he possessed, but of everything he had chosen to protect. Emily leaned against his arm. "Did you save her violin?" she whispered. Dan watched Sophie tighten the final peg by herself. "No," he said. "I just kept it safe until she could." For a moment no one spoke. Not because they were shocked, and not because someone powerful had entered the room, but because everyone understood that the violin had never made Sophie valuable, wealth had never made Eleanor family, and Dan's kindness had not become important only after the world noticed it. Like the final note still trembling in the wood, dignity had been there all along, quiet and unbroken, waiting for truth to give it room to be heard.